Our friend Mike, who's an owner of a video game store in Kitchener, Ontario called Retro Replay, reached out to us to loan us an item from his video game collection that he thought would be really cool to show off on the show. And you know what, folks? I agree with him. This is a binder. Now, usually binders aren't that interesting, but this one has a lot going into it that you might find really cool. This binder itself originated from the early 2000s from a video game store called EBgames, which is the Canadian equivalent of Gamestop. This right here has a whole bunch of Nintendo video games that were supposed to come out, but some of them didn't. Let's take a closer look. As strange as it may seem now, binders like this were commonplace in video game stores around the world. The idea was that if somebody was working at a video game store and didn't know enough about a specific video game, all they had to do was open up the binder and look for more information inside. And sometimes, these binders would be looked over by people that were working at the stores just to learn more information about the games so that they could be prepared when a customer came in asking specific information about a title that they may never have heard of before. Binders like this were more prevalent before the widespread use of the internet, and the reason why was, well, most people that needed information about video games had few sources to find them. You'd probably buy a video game magazine, probably watch Electric Playground, or something like that. But when it came to going to a store to find out about these video games directly, this was simply the best way to learn about them. The average consumer that was interested in video games typically wasn't going online and doing research about the games they were about to buy. Even though in the early 2000s we started to see a lot of people get online, it still wasn't as widespread as it is today. And while many companies made binders like this, it really was something that Nintendo was exceedingly good at. Nintendo had a fantastic relationship with their customers. And when I say customers, I'm not saying folks like you and I who play and buy video games, I'm talking about customers. These are the stores and the retailers that would buy Nintendo games directly to sell to consumers. And throughout this binder, they will refer to customers directly as the retailers themselves. But why are we even talking about that? Because that's not really that interesting, right? The stuff in here should be games that everybody knows, but that's not the case, because there are games that were actually announced in this very binder that ended up not coming out. And in many instances, they did come out, but on other systems. Let's take a look. First off, there's a number of titles in here that are referenced by a name that isn't actually what they were released under. There's one here called Animal Forest, which actually ended up becoming Animal Crossing. Another one here is just called The Legend of Zelda. It's marked for Gamecube, and that ended up being The Legend of Zelda Wind Waker. And at the very end here, there's Mario Kart, which ended up being Mario Kart Double Dash. This is actually a very commonplace thing to see from Nintendo. They'll announce a beloved franchise is coming to a system, but they haven't actually quite nailed down the name yet. But there are some games in this binder that did have finalized names, but they just never came out, as is the case with Donkey Kong Coconut Crackers. This was a puzzle game developed by Rare and originally announced by Nintendo back in 2001 for the Game Boy Advance. In the game, you could score points by creating shapes, rectangles and squares specifically. The gameplay would consist of Donkey Kong's coconuts falling towards the playfield. They were also filled with paint, and they kinda looked like Tetramino shapes. You would use the falling shapes strategically to make colored rectangles and squares on the ground, and the player would be doing this to accumulate points and create combos. Kremlin characters would interfere with your shape making by trying to walk over and destroy the shapes you were building. The player's successful moves with the dropping coconuts would allow Donkey Kong characters to arrive and push back the troublesome advancing Kremlins. Originally, the game had an isometric gameplay grid, but what would make the game stand out from other games of this specific style, like Tetris or something like that, is that it would feature the aesthetics of Donkey Kong Country, something that Rare was very familiar with, having made those games on the SNES. DK's Coconut Crackers was supposed to have several challenging play modes, which would have been consistent with other puzzle games like Tetris, where it offered you more challenging feats depending on what level you chose. There was also supposed to be a multiplayer component with up to 4 players that was made possible by the GBA link cable. Unfortunately though, this game would never come out, due to the fact that during its development, Microsoft had purchased Rare. At this point in time, the Donkey Kong license went back to Nintendo, seemingly stopping the game development in its tracks. Fortunately for us gamers though, something lucky did happen. Rare rebranded the game as Mr. Pants. It was still a puzzle game, but without the multiplayer or isometric views that were supposed to be in the Donkey Kong Coconut Crackers original. Instead of Microsoft publishing the title, it was instead published by THQ in 2004. Likely because Microsoft didn't want to produce a game that was going to exist on a competitor's video game platform. Something that's interesting, in the Mr. Pants version of the game, Kremlins were replaced by an antagonistic snake called the Pants Snake. Yeah, that's the name. And of course, the name of this character was taken out of the final game as it was considered a little bit too risque. But the pants snake joke clearly wasn't forgotten by Rare employees, as a trouser snake character was later added to the Banjo-Kazooie-like game, Yooka-Laylee. Donkey Kong Coconut Crackers was not the only GBA game that was being developed by Rare. In fact, the other one was also in the Donkey Kong universe, and it was called Diddy Kong Pilot. Just like the previous game, this one was also announced in 2001, and as you might imagine, it's supposed to be a portable version of Diddy Kong Racing from the Nintendo 64. Although the Game Boy Advance is a pretty capable system, it simply isn't as powerful as a Nintendo 64. So what they decided to do was create a look that was close to a Mode 7-like design that's something very familiar to gamers who have played Super Mario Kart on the SNES. The game would include many different play modes like single-player, multiplayer tournaments, time trials, and even story modes for each character, each one by the way ending in a one-on-one boss duel. You could also link up several Game Boy Advances through the link cable and have thrilling dogfights with your friends. Something that would have made the game a little bit more unique was the fact that it was supposed to include a tilt sensor inside the cartridge itself. The same concept of a tilt sensor was eventually used with WarioWare Twisted on the GBA. In Diddy Kong Pilot though, the sensor would have given you the ability to control your racer with movements without having to touch the D-pad. But of course, you would have been able to use the D-pad if you wanted, it was just an option. The game would also feature interactive backgrounds, upgradable weapons and power-ups, and unlockable secrets like any good Rare game would. But again, as with the case of Donkey Kong Coconut Crackers, Rare was purchased by Microsoft and it switched up everything about this game. With the Donkey Kong license gone again, they had to figure out some way to get this game out. Like Mr. Pants, they could have created a whole new unique character, or maybe they could visit a character that they owned internally at Rare. And of course, the game came out as Banjo Pilot. The game used several characters from the Banjo universe. Banjo Pilot was released several years after Diddy Kong Pilot's initial announcement in 2005, and instead of being published by Nintendo, the game was instead published, just like Mr. Pants, by THQ. Interestingly enough, even though they had to drop the Donkey Kong characters, the soundtrack in the game on Banjo Pilot still pulls inspiration from Donkey Kong Country. While we may never see an official release of Diddy Kong Pilot, all the footage you've been seeing of this game being played right here is a playable beta version that was released online a few years ago. In both of these cases with these two Game Boy Advance games, we eventually did see versions released on the Game Boy Advance. But what about a game that was initially announced for a Nintendo console, let's say the Gamecube, that didn't actually come out on that platform? Well, let's take a look at Cameo Elements of Power. Cameo is an action-adventure fantasy game by Rare that was in production for a really long time. The production of the game originally started on the Nintendo 64, and then it eventually went to the Gamecube. By this point though, just like with the other Rare games we mentioned, Microsoft had purchased Rare. Now, unlike the other Game Boy Advance games we mentioned that were eventually produced and released onto the system in various forms by THQ, Microsoft was probably a little bit more hesitant on this front. Where the Game Boy Advance didn't really have a direct competitor with Microsoft in the portable gaming field, you can bet your jiggies that they weren't going to allow a home console release to exist on another competitor's platform while they own the keys to the company. So they didn't let THQ produce this one. Instead, they chose the path of producing the game themselves and releasing it on their own system, the Xbox. But unfortunately, that didn't happen. The game eventually would be released on the Xbox 360 and not the original Xbox. That means that this game right here went through 4 different console generations. Game development can take a really long time, but to see any one game go through that long of a development cycle is pretty unheard of in the industry. The original GameCube version of the game had different character designs that you will not find in the Xbox 360 release. The binder itself lists the game as a monster training raising game, saying that you can command up to 60 creatures. Later, the game was rumored to have around 100 creatures. When Cameo was originally designed, it was influenced heavily by Pokemon, so of course, in this game, you were supposed to catch and evolve creatures. The creatures you would train and evolve would follow you and act on their own. This is something you wouldn't see in a normal Pokemon game because in Pokemon, they would all be inside little Pokeballs. But as development of the game moved to the Xbox, it started to lose many of the collect, grow, and evolve elements that were supposed to make it a standout title. This would result in the game being quite different. The team decided to refocus how the game played, taking some elements of previous builds and refocusing them. The player character Cameo would now morph into different creatures to traverse levels and solve puzzles. Also, the game would would be more action combat heavy. Rare also cut down on the amount of different friendly creatures available in the game, rumored to be down from 100 to just a dozen. The few creatures that did remain in the game, though, received greater abilities and skill sets. As development progressed under Microsoft, Rare wanted to change the look of the game and distance itself from its cutesy past with Nintendo. They struggled to make a game that felt different from their known aesthetic. They decided to change Cameo from a fairy to an elf, and that really didn't do much because even though it did change a little bit of the look, in my opinion, it's still pretty cutesy. For anyone at the time period that would have walked into this video game store and had been told about this video game, the binder here clearly states that the game was made exclusively for the Nintendo Gamecube by Rare. And this is the kind of stuff that would cause issues in the future, and one of the reasons why you really don't see these binders anymore. If the game were to be cancelled or pushed to another platform, with the internet we'd find out right away. But with a binder, that information would have been in there for a very long time and likely wouldn't have changed. Cameo Elements of Power may have gone through one strange production cycle, but eventually it did get released on the Xbox 360. Unfortunately though, that wasn't the case for every game that Rare was working on, because some of them simply couldn't be saved. Within this binder, you'll find a page dedicated to Donkey Kong Racing. That's right, Diddy Kong Pilot wasn't the only racing game they were producing at the same time utilizing the Donkey Kong characters. 2001 would mark the final year that Nintendo would host Space World, which essentially was a trade show for video games, but more specifically, just video games made by Nintendo. And it was at this very trade show that we would see the first tech demo for Donkey Kong Racing. The game was set to feature tons of characters from Donkey Kong Country and Diddy Kong Racing as well. By this point in time, there were tons of kart racing games, so in order to break that mold, characters in this game would be riding animals and not carts. Many of these animals as well were ones you could find in the Donkey Kong Country series, and you would supposedly be able to switch the animals mid-race, adding a little bit of variety to the gameplay. The larger animals that the characters would race with would be able to destroy some obstacles. Think about it in the same way you would see in Donkey Kong Country, where you could take that rhino and break through walls. Kind of a nice callback to those earlier games. And with the smaller animals that you'd be able to ride, they would be faster and more maneuverable. It's a neat idea that definitely would have made an interesting game if it was actually made. But after the Microsoft purchase, the game was cancelled and the developer moved on to creating Xbox games. The game was rumored to have been attempted to be ported to Xbox. Supposedly, it was an attempted reskin of the Donkey Kong Racing idea using Rare's Saberman character, a character they hadn't used in a number of years. The reskin project was dubbed Saberman Stampede. In March 2004, when asked about whether or not Donkey Kong Racing was still in development, Rare released a statement on the project. Just kidding, they actually said this.
Well, yes and no. It's not called Donkey Kong Racing anymore. It's not for the GameCube anymore, and by this point, I imagine so little of the original art and code remains that it's barely even the same game anymore. But yes, it's still coming out in some form.
After some leaked footage of Saberman came out in 2008, the project was shown to be very different from what Donkey Kong Racing originally was. It seemed less like a straightforward kart racer and more like a driving adventure game, similar to the style of Diddy Kong Racing's semi-open hub world. Unfortunately though, Saberman Stampede was later cancelled and many of the team went on to work on Cameo and Perfect Dark Zero, transitioning those games from the original Xbox to the Xbox 360. This is simply a game that we will never play because, well, it's probably too late by now for it to have actually come out. Now by this point, you're probably sick and tired hearing about Rare games, but Rare wasn't the only company making games or at least announcing games for the GameCube itself, and one such company and their game is listed in this binder. And that game is called Raven Blade by Retro Studios. The story to this game begins all the way back in 1998 when Retro Studios was founded. Initially, it was a partnership between Nintendo and the founder of Iguana Entertainment, Jeff Spangenberg. Iguana Entertainment had made a number of games, but one of their most famous games is Turok the Dinosaur Hunter, which was a big success on the Nintendo 64. Nintendo realized that their user base was starting to grow up, and they needed to make games that targeted that specific demographic. But I also personally believe there was something a little more to it. The success of the Sony PlayStation completely caught Nintendo off guard, and a bunch of the games that were made on that system were made with North American game developers. These developers had a different way of approaching game design that you simply didn't see in Japan. So what Nintendo could have done was make these games in-house, but they likely wouldn't have made games that would have appealed to the majority of their gamers in North America. So instead, making a North American-founded video game studio with the help of somebody that had a lot of experience in North American game design was probably the best way to move forward. But that's where the story starts to get really complex. Not only did Retro Studios start working on one game, they started working on 4. The company started small with 4 people in 1998, but due to all the projects they were taking on board, they eventually ballooned to 200 by the year 2000. The team was working on an action-adventure game simply called Action Adventure, another game that was called Car Combat and also known as Thunder Rally, an American football simulator called NFL Retro Football. But it's the 4th game, Raven Blade, that we're going to be talking about right here. Although not much is known about the plot of Raven Blade, the player would control an unnamed protagonist who would have the Raven Blade as a weapon. The antagonist's name was Beastlord, and your character was said to be on a mission to rid the world of evil. Early in development, it was supposed to be a traditional RPG with turn-based combat, but it was later changed to become more of a real-time action battle system. The game had been conceived by 2 game designers. One of them was Steve Barcia, who was most notable up until this point for having created Master of Orion 1 and 2, and also Master of Magic. And the other, serving as senior designer, was David Cook, who had a whole bunch of experience in designing pen and paper tabletop RPGs. Eventually, Raven Blade would be showcased at the Electronic Entertainment Expo in 2001, but trouble was around the corner. It's been rumored that there were a ton of production problems due to Retro Studios taking on 4 projects at once before releasing any one single game for public release. While all 4 games were slowing in development, it was rumored that Raven Blade specifically was having issues with its battle system. It was constantly being tweaked, and the developers were never satisfied with it. But it was Nintendo themselves that appeared to be the most upset with how Retro Studios had been performing up until this point. With the studio in chaos and the idea that they were going farther and farther behind schedule, Nintendo stepped in. Shigeru Miyamoto, the father of Super Mario Bros., The Legend of Zelda, and countless classic Nintendo IPs, visited the studio to see what they've been producing all this time. Miyamoto was virtually unimpressed with everything he had seen. By this point in time, he probably didn't think much of Raven Blade because they were also developing a Zelda game internally at Nintendo that was set to be released on the Gamecube, which would eventually become Wind Waker, showing an RPG that had been in development for a very long time that featured a real-time action battle system that Retro Studios themselves weren't really confident with. To the creator of Zelda, likely wasn't the smartest move. Nintendo would inform Retro Studios that if they didn't see improvements to the titles by July 24th, 2001, the game would be cancelled. 5 days before the deadline, Retro announced the game's cancellation. But while Shigeru Miyamoto was being shown off a bunch of games, that one weird game that didn't actually have a title called Action Adventure had a game engine that Miyamoto thought was really interesting. He suggested that they take that exact same engine and utilize an existing Nintendo IP and make an entirely new game. And that game ended up becoming Metroid Prime. The game was incredibly well received and put Retro Studios on the map, but for many people out there that were given information by binders like this, they still longed and looked for that one lost game that they never got to see, known as Raven Blade. These documents mark a moment in time where Nintendo and the companies involved with them were so excited to share the experiences of games that were going to be on the horizon, and none of them knew at that point when they were talking about these games that they would never be released. Many of the concepts and ideas presented in these titles never saw the light of day, but at least the memory of what these games were are retained in documents and marketing material like this. And maybe, just maybe, some of these game companies can work together and release the earlier versions of these games so gamers like us can finally play them. But we'll never know if that's gonna happen for sure. You might be lucky enough to find other binders that look exactly like this from Microsoft, Sony, and even Sega, detailing a whole bunch of lost hidden information from games that never came out. And we really wanted to thank the folks at Unseen64 for making this episode happen. They loaned us a whole bunch of their video game footage, and if you want to learn more about those games, head over to their website in the description below.